That night, I thought it would be just another quiet evening, a cup of tea, the hum of the old clock in my living room, and the gentle creak of my rocking chair. I never imagined that Ethan, my grandson, would walk into my house and say something that would echo in my mind long after the night ended. His words still keep me awake even now, not because they frightened me, but because they opened a door in my heart I didn't know was still there. Before I start, tell me, from which city are you watching us tonight? I love imagining these stories reaching people in places I've never been, from small towns with quiet streets to big cities that never sleep. It was late autumn, and the air outside carried that sharp chill that nips at your ears and fingertips. My little house sat at the edge of town, the kind of place where the street lamps cast warm pools of light, and you can hear leaves scraping along the sidewalk when the wind picks up. Inside, the atmosphere was cozy. The fireplace crackled softly, the curtains swayed ever so slightly with the draft, and the scent of cinnamon from a candle lingered in the air. Ethan had called earlier that evening, saying he might stop by after visiting a friend. I didn't think much of it. He often dropped in unexpectedly, usually to share some small news from his life or help me with something around the house. He was 26 now, tall and lean, with that kind of quiet confidence that seemed to have deepened in recent years. Still, to me, he was always the boy who used to sit at my kitchen table, swinging his legs, asking for another slice of pie. When he arrived, it was just past 9. I heard his footsteps on the porch before the knock on the door. I opened it to find him standing there, his cheeks slightly pink from the cold, hands tucked in the pockets of his jacket. His eyes, that same deep hazel his mother had, seemed more thoughtful than usual, as if he'd been turning something over in his mind all evening. "Come in, you'll freeze out there," I said, stepping aside. He smiled faintly and walked in, his presence filling the room with a familiar warmth. We settled in the living room, and I poured him a cup of tea. He cradled it in his hands, staring into the steam like it might give him answers. There was a weight in the air I couldn't quite name. Usually Ethan was quick to tell me about his day, but tonight he was quieter, almost hesitant. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock and the occasional pop from the fire. "You're awfully quiet," I said after a while, leaning forward in my chair. "Something on your mind?" He glanced at me, then looked away as though choosing his words with care. "Yeah," he said softly. "I've been thinking about us, about the kind of person you've been in my life." The way he said it made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure where he was going with it, but his tone was different. It wasn't the casual offhand way someone speaks about family over dinner. It was more deliberate, more layered. "I don't think I've ever told you," he continued, "how much you've shaped the way I see the world and the way I see people." His words caught me off guard. I had spent years wondering if the little things I did, baking him his favorite cookies, listening when he needed to talk, sharing stories about his grandfather, had really mattered. Now here he was telling me in that quiet, steady voice that they had. But there was something else in his gaze, something unspoken. His eyes lingered on mine longer than they normally would, like he was holding back more than he was saying. I shifted slightly in my seat, feeling an odd mix of pride, curiosity, and something I couldn't quite name. "Ethan, what's brought this on tonight?" I asked. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his voice low. "I guess I realize that life moves faster than we think, and sometimes we leave things unsaid for too long." The firelight flickered across his face, casting soft shadows that made him look older, wiser. I studied him for a moment, trying to read between the lines. I could sense there was more, much more behind his words. It wasn't just gratitude. It was personal, deeply personal. I found myself remembering the summer after his grandfather passed, when Ethan had spent weeks here helping me with the garden. We had shared quiet mornings over coffee, afternoons pruning roses, and evenings sitting side by side on the porch watching the sun slip away. There had been a closeness in those days, the kind that doesn't always need words to exist. But as the years passed, life had pulled him into his own world and me into mine. "Sometimes," he said, pulling me back to the present, "we don't realize how important someone is until we think about what life would be like without them." The way he looked at me then, steady, searching, made my breath pitch just slightly. I could feel the heat from the fire, but there was another kind of warmth rising in me, one that had nothing to do with the flames. A part of me wanted to press him, to ask exactly what he meant. Another part of me hesitated, afraid of changing the delicate balance of this moment. Instead, I smiled softly and said, "Well, I'm not planning on going anywhere anytime soon." He smiled back, but there was a trace of sadness in it, as if my words only touched the surface of what he was feeling. He leaned back in his chair, still holding his tea, but his gaze never left mine. For the rest of the evening, our conversation drifted between small memories and shared laughter, but that earlier moment hung between us like a thread connecting 2 points across time. Every so often I'd catch him looking at me the same way he had earlier, and it made my heart beat just a little faster. When he finally left, the night had deepened, and the air outside was sharp with cold. I stood at the door watching him walk away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet street. But even after I closed the door, I could still feel the weight of his words and the way he had looked at me. And that night, as I lay in bed listening to the wind rustle the trees outside, I found myself replaying it all over and over again. The firelight on his face, the warmth in his voice, and that unshakable feeling that there was something more he wanted to tell me. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to hear, but couldn't stop wondering about. The house always felt different the day after a long night of thinking. Morning light slipped through the lace curtains in narrow gold bands, laying themselves across my kitchen table like quiet visitors. The radio murmured an old song from the 70s, one of those ballads that build slow, the melody soft as warm bread. I moved through the familiar motions, kettle, cups, the same small clink of ceramic, trying to anchor myself in the ordinary, while my thoughts kept circling back to Ethan's eyes, and the weight of what he hadn't said. By the time the clock in the hall struck 11, I'd polished the silver sugar spoon I never used, and refold the dish towels until their corners lined up like soldiers. I told myself to stop fussing, to sit, to breathe. Outside, the sky was the pewter color that means rain is thinking about it. I pulled my sweater tight around my shoulders, walked into the living room, and stood by the fireplace as if I could coax last night's embers back just by looking at them. The knock startled me, even though I'd been listening for it without admitting I was. One strong rap, then a second that sounded unsure of itself. I opened the door to Ethan. No jacket this time, just a navy sweatshirt, and that same thoughtful expression, as if he had walked the few blocks from his apartment, carefully choosing each step like a sentence. "I made too much tea," I said, because it was easier than hello. "Come save me from myself." He smiled. "I can do that." We sat at the table with steam wreathing our faces. He rested his hands flat on either side of the cup, eyes down, and I studied the familiar constellation of freckles on his knuckles, the small scar from when he fell off his bike at 7. It's funny how the body keeps a history you can read without words. "I kept thinking about what I said last night," he began. The radio faded into a commercial. Somewhere a dog barked and then thought better of it. "There's more. I didn't want to drop it on you at 9:30 at night and then run off." "It wouldn't have been the first time someone did that to me," I said lightly, then softened it with a smile. "But I appreciate the courtesy." He glanced up, the ghost of a laugh in his eyes. "You always do that." "What?" "Take the heat out of a moment without putting out the fire." He shook his head. "I don't know how you do it." "I had a good teacher," I said, and we both knew I meant his grandfather. The thought of him slid between us, kind eyes, oil under his nails, the way he'd lift a hand when a joke landed and say, "There it is. There's the laugh I was looking for." The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan reached into his backpack and set a small shoebox-sized tin on the table. The metal was dented. The hinged lid rubbed to dullness at the edges. "I found this yesterday," he said. "At Mom's, in the crawl space above the garage." He pushed it toward me with 2 fingers, like he was easing a small boat into still water. It was his. My throat got tight so fast I had to swallow twice before I could speak. "But grandfather kept a lot of boxes," I said, though I knew the feel of this one by sight. The weight of it, the way the lid rasped when it opened. I'd wrapped that tin in tissue paper and tucked it into a cedar chest almost 40 years ago. How had it migrated here and there and finally to a crawl space? We set things aside. We tell ourselves for later. And then years gallop by while we're busy doing dishes. "Open it," he said softly. The lid lifted with that sandpaper sigh I remembered. Inside lay bundles of letters tied with unruly string. Some envelopes yellow to the color of old cream, others crisp as winter light. On top was a photograph I hadn't seen in decades. Me and him, sunstruck and squinting, standing beside the old pickup at the edge of a field whose hay had been cut into clean rows. My hair was longer, my smile careless. His arm was looped around my shoulders, hand draped like an easy promise. I touched the photo with one fingertip. Where did you find this exactly? Mom was cleaning and asked me to help. We found a false panel behind the boxes of Christmas lights. This was wedged back there. She said she didn't put it there. She thought maybe I should bring it to you. He paused. I read one letter. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, but I needed to know if it was what I thought. I didn't ask which letter. I could feel it like a thread leading straight to the heart of something I'd folded away so carefully I'd convinced myself it belonged to another woman's life. He wrote to you, Ethan said, voice steady, the year before I was born, a lot. He never mailed them. I nodded. He had a way of speaking on paper when the mouth failed him. Ethan turned one bundle and slid off the string, gentle as a priest undressing the altar. He placed a letter between us. The handwriting was his, tilted a little to the right, loops clean and unashamed. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to yet. The words lived under my ribs. They had for years. He wrote about your courage, Ethan went on, about how he admired that you kept choosing us even when it wasn't easy, about the night the truck wouldn't start and you laughed instead of crying, and how that told him everything he needed to know about what kind of life you were building together. He swallowed. He wrote about the things he never said out loud. The kettle clicked off in the other room, though I couldn't remember turning it on. Rain finally decided and began to whisper against the roof. I want to tell you what I was trying to say last night, Ethan said. But I need you to know I'm not asking you for anything. I'm giving you something, or trying to. He sat another envelope down. This one addressed to me in a careful print. No stamp, no date. I knew what it was before he said it. He wrote you a letter the week before he passed. Ethan said it was on the bottom of the box. I think he meant for you to find it someday when it would be the right time. He lifted his eyes and held mine. I think he trusted that the right time would find you. Hands can be brave when the heart isn't ready. Mine were steady as I slid a finger under the flap. The paper was thin, the ink faint in a few places where the pen must have skipped. I read silently. Ethan sat with his gaze down, giving me the dignity of privacy, even in a small kitchen where the air felt as if it had thickened to honey. Emily, if you're reading this, it means time did what time does. I wrote these because sometimes I drove past the post office and could not make myself stop. Not because I didn't want the words to reach you, but because I couldn't bear to think I might tie you to my private weather, when all I ever wanted was to keep you in the sun. There is a thing I never said because I wanted to be strong for you. I knew you would have a second act. I saw it in you the day you fixed the toaster with a butter knife and a prayer. You have always found your way back to the light, even when the map burned. I want you to promise me something, only if it doesn't cost you. When the day comes that the house feels too quiet, let the quiet be a door, not a wall. Step through, take the trip, learn the thing, sit in the front row, laugh so hard somebody turns around to see who is making that sound and wishes they could sit next to you. If you need a sign, let it be this. It's okay to begin again. Marcus. The words lifted off the page and hung in the air between us, the way steam does from a kettle, visible for a beat, then part of the room itself. I placed the letter on the table as if it might bruise and pressed my palm over it. I didn't cry. I expected I might, but something steady arose in me instead, like a hand on my back. Ethan cleared his throat. There's more, he said. My part. I looked up. He was sitting straighter, like he grew an inch while I read. I put in my notice, he said. At the firm, he let the sentence land. I've been miserable for a long time and saying I wasn't. I bought into this idea that if I wore the right shirt and clicked the right boxes, I'd be the person I was supposed to be. His mouth twisted. I was wrong. I've been volunteering 2 nights a week at the community center mentoring. It's the first time in 2 years I've gone home with that feeling like I can breathe all the way down. I studied him, saw the truth of it in the looser set of his shoulders, the way he occupied the chair like it belonged to him now rather than asked permission from it. I'm scared, he said, almost a whisper. But it's the good kind of scared. He exhaled. And I kept thinking about you. About how you've been here for me at every crossroads, never pushing, just standing on the shoulder with a thermos and a blanket in case I broke down. He rubbed his palms together. I don't want to wait to say things. I don't want to let the people I love guess at how much I need them and what they mean to me. He reached into the backpack again and pulled out a folded paper, heavy stock, the edges slightly frayed like it had been taken out, and put back a dozen times. I made you something, he said and slid it across. A map. I opened it. It wasn't the country with lines and interstates. It was us. He'd drawn tiny, careful pictures. A pear tree with a swing. Our backyard when he was 5. A porch with a crooked step. I've been promising to fix that step for 10 years. The little diner with the lemon meringue pie we always declared the winner of all pies and then forgot we declared it. Along the right side a wavy line labeled the ocean, and beside it a small lighthouse with beams reaching like open arms. The last part is the only part that's not this town, he said. There's a place up the coast you used to talk about where you and Grandpa went once. He pointed to the lighthouse. You said the water there was the color of forgiveness. I wrote it down when I was 10 and never forgot. He cleared his throat. I want to take you there. The kitchen clock ticked slow and loud. I could hear the old house settling. Wood talking to wood. I looked at the map at the lighthouse at my grandson, who had brought me a box of letters and a drawing of a new road, and suddenly the space between then and now felt like a bridge instead of a gulf. I don't drive highways anymore, I said. A flimsy protest against what was already unfurling in me like a flag. I know, he said. I'll drive. We go slow. Pick the scenic route and stop for coffee in places with pie under glass. We'll bring the box. He nodded toward the letters. We can read one at each stop. If I want. The kindness of that clause broke something open in me. Choice is a generous love. I ran a thumb along the inked lighthouse beam. What about your apartment, your life, all the routines you've built like fences? He shrugged a boy again for a flicker. I'll still have them when I get back. Or I won't. Maybe I'll have better ones. He smiled, small and honest. You told me once that every good change starts with a good goodbye. We sat with the soft rain, the paper map, a small continent of possibility between us. I imagined the road rising out of town like a ribbon. The truck I'd borrow Sophia's, she never minds. Shouldering up hills and coasting down. The radio tuned to something that plays the old stuff without apology. I imagined the first night in a motel with a sign that flickers, the kind of bedspread with tiny flowers that don't match anything. The two of us leaning over a letter written by a man who had loved me with the kind of certainty you can feel like a tide. What were the words I said that kept you up last night? Ethan asked suddenly, as if the question had just arrived. There was mischief in it but also care. I realized then what they were. The ones that had padded around my room like a cat all night, settling and resettling, refusing to let me forget. Not his exact sentences but the meaning inside them. Don't let the rest of your life be an echo. Let it be a song you haven't sung yet. And will you let me help you find the first note? You said. I told him, and my voice came out sure that it's okay to begin again. His smile spread slow, the kind that lays a hand on a shoulder and says, we've got time. He stood and reached for his cup, carried it to the sink without being asked, ran water. The small ordinary gestures braided themselves into something strong enough to hold us. When would we leave? I heard myself ask, and the way his head snapped up told me he'd been half afraid I'd say someday, which is another way of saying never. Saturday, he ventured, then quickly added. Or later if you need. I can. Saturday, I said, and felt the word seed itself in my chest like a bird finding a branch that will hold. We'll keep it simple. A bag each. No gifts to buy anyone. We'll bring the letters and the map and sensible shoes, and a sweater for when the wind decides we look like people worth teasing. He laughed, surprised and relieved at once. You always say the wind's a trickster. It is, I said, but he's an honest one. He tells you the truth about the weather and yourself. Ethan came around the table and folded me into a hug that was neither careful nor careless. It was perfect. He smelled faintly of laundry soap and rain. I felt the steady drum of his heart, and thought of how many seasons a heart carries without complaint, how it keeps learning new rhythms if you let it. When he left, the rain had eased to a fine mist, the kind that doesn't bother with the ground, but whispers to the air. I stood at the doorway and watched him go, the map under my arm like a secret. The street was quiet. Somewhere a television murmured an afternoon game. Somewhere a neighbor's wind chime worked out a tune. Back inside, I cleared the table and tucked Marcus's letter into the pocket of my sweater, as if I might need to touch it and be steadied by the shape of his penmanship. I wiped a small ring of tea, the cup had left behind, and thought about how all our lives are made of rings. Years, seasons, the circles we draw around what we don't want to lose. Sometimes we widen the circle. Sometimes we step outside it. I went to the bedroom and pulled the old suitcase from under the bed. It slid out with a sigh like the tins, as if all these years everything had been practicing for this. I set it on the quilt and opened it. Inside was the scent of cedar and something else. Possibility, maybe if possibility had a smell. I laid in a sweater, 2 blouses, the photograph from the box, the map. I stood back, hands on my hips, and laughed out loud at myself for packing in the middle of a weekday, at my age, as the sky decided between gray and some promise beyond gray. The phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. Found my old Polaroid. Bringing it. We'll make our own postcards. I typed back. Bring a thermos. I'll bring the penknife just in case. He sent a heart. I sent the lighthouse emoji, which I didn't even know my phone had until my thumb found it like it knew better than I did. Later, as the light leaned toward evening, I made a simple dinner and ate it at the counter. I put the radio back on and let the soft static sit with the melodies. The house didn't feel lonely. It felt like a room between rooms, threshold space, the place you stand while you reach for the next doorknob. The box of letters rested on the coffee table, patient. I picked up one, not the final one, not the first, just the right feeling middle, and read a paragraph about a Tuesday that had no business being as beautiful as it was. Marcus wrote about a grocery list that ended with peaches, even though it was spring, because he believed in optimism. He wrote about how he watched me laugh with the butcher, and knew we would be okay as long as laughter stayed in stock. When I turned off the lamps and went to bed, the rain had stopped. The air through the cracked window smelled like wet concrete and cut grass and the far metallic promise of the sea, though I knew the sea was miles and miles away. I lay awake, but not the way I had the night before. Last night had been a loop. Tonight was a line, straight and true, pointing somewhere. The words that kept me awake had changed shape, softened at the edges, invited sleep to sit beside them instead of standing guard against it. It's okay to begin again. I whispered it to the dark, and the dark for once whispered it.